They took the house. They took the truck with the good tyres. They left her a 14-year-old sedan with a check engine light that never turned off. They handed her a dollar bill, a cabin nobody had swept in a year. They laughed while they did it. She said thank you. Then she drove out to the pines. She started prying at a wall. Let me take you back to 6 weeks. Back before the dollar. Before the laugh. Back to the morning the lawyer's office in Coles Ferry, Idaho, still smelled like her grandfather's coffee. Nobody had thought to clean the pot. The lawyer slid a single dollar bill across the table, said the cabin in the pines was hers. Behind Della, the whole room laughed. Sam jolted awake on her hip. The dollar fluttered to the floor. Nobody bent to pick it up. $1, Glenn Mercer said. He grinned like a man who'd already spent it. Has to be something. Can't leave a beneficiary with nothing. Frank says it's a legal thing. Frank Ostrander, the family lawyer, didn't laugh. He watched Della's face the way a man watches a fuse he already lit. The house on Larkin Street, he read. The accounts at Panhandle State Bank. The F250. The tractor. 40% of the timber royalties. All to Glenn and Carol Mercer. In recognition of their care for Hollis Mercer in his final years. Carol Mercer touched her pearl earring, checked it hadn't melted from the joy. We were always closer to Hollis, she said, to nobody, to the room. Blood tells. And to Della Mercer, Frank read on, granddaughter. The cabin property on Forest Road 9, Bonner County, known locally as the Mercer Shack, and its contents. Silence. Then Glenn laughed first, a short bark. Carol caught it a half-second later, like she'd been waiting for permission. The shack, Glenn said. God love him. Least he was consistent. Della didn't answer. She'd learned a long time ago that answering Glenn only fed him. She shifted Sam higher on her hip, felt his small fist close on her collar. She looked at the check engine light in her memory instead of the room. It was easier than looking at her uncle's face. Frank cleared his throat. There's also a token bequest, he said. He pulled a small manila envelope from the folder. Inside it was exactly $1, folded once. Mr. Mercer wanted this given to Della personally. With a note, he handed it over. The note was in Hollis's crabbed carpenter's hand. I didn't leave you the cabin, girl. I left you the warmest wall in it. Mine which one stays warm. Della read it twice. She didn't understand it. She put it in her jacket pocket anyway, next to Sam's mitten. She said, thank you out loud. To the room. To Glenn. To the ceiling. Carol actually blinked at that. You're welcome, she said, uncertain, like thanks was a language she hadn't studied. Outside, in the parking lot, Della sat in the sedan. The check engine light glowed amber on the dash. She counted the money in her wallet twice, not because the number changed, because $31 sometimes asked for a recount. She was 23. She had a 2-year-old son named Sam. Right then he was chewing on his car seat strap, concentrating hard, like he'd found the one good thing left in that car. She had $31, a landlord who wanted rent Friday, and a dead grandfather's dollar bill folded next to a mitten in her jacket pocket. She had technically a cabin. She drove there because she had nowhere else that was hers. Forest Road 9 ran 11 miles out of Coles Ferry, past the mill that had closed, past the one that hadn't, past a church with a sign still wishing Merry Christmas from 2 Decembers back. The gravel narrowed, the lodgepole pines closed in tight enough to touch both windows, if you were fool enough to try. The cabin sat at the end of it, 1 room and a lean-to, a tin roof gone the colour of a nickel left out in the rain. She'd been coming out here every Sunday for 3 years, not because anyone asked her to, because somebody had to. She'd sweep the floor, wipe the dust off the one window, lay kindling in the old cast-iron cook stove, even in July, even though nobody had lit it since before Sam was born. In case Grandpa's ghost gets cold, she used to tell Sam. Half a joke. Sam was too young to know it was a joke. He'd nod anyway, like it made all the sense in the world. Nobody thanked her for it. Glenn called it morbid. Carol called it a waste of gas money Della didn't have. Della called it the only thing that felt like hers. She parked, lifted Sam onto her hip, let herself in with the same brass key she'd had since she was 14. Hollis had handed it to her that year, no ceremony, and said, "You're the one who'll come back." He'd been right. Nobody else in the family had set foot on Forest Road 9 in a decade. The cabin was cold and small. It smelled like pine sap and old smoke. It was undeniably hers now, along with $31. And a boy who needed dinner. She set Sam down on the rag rug with a wooden spoon and a pot to bang. That trick had bought her 10 quiet minutes since he was 1. She looked at the cast-iron cookstove against the far wall. Black. Cold. The same stove Hollis had cooked eggs on every morning of his life that she could remember. She thought about the note. The warmest wall. It was July. No wall in that cabin was warm, but habit was habit. Della Mercer was, if nothing else, a woman who finished what she started. She opened the stove's firebox, laid 3 sticks of kindling the way Hollis had taught her. Cross-hatched, room to breathe, she struck a match. If she was going to sit here thinking about a note that made no sense, she might as well be warm doing it. The fire caught. Small. Orange. Honest. Sam clapped at it like it was a magic trick. She'd need groceries by Wednesday. Gas before that. She calculated for the 3rd time, $31. And a stack of unopened envelopes from Panhandle State Bank sitting in the sedan's glove box. She hadn't had the courage to open them in 9 days. She was good at that, at least. The not opening, the holding steady, the getting up anyway. She'd worked the overnight stock shift at the Coles Ferry Thriftway for 2 years. Never missed one. She'd carried Sam in a sling until he got too big for it. She could restock a collapsed pallet of canned goods faster than anyone on shift. Nobody in her family had ever once asked about that. It wasn't a fortune. It was a fact about her hands. And her hands, she'd come to understand, were the only inheritance nobody could take. The fire crackled. The stove's iron side began, slowly, to warm. Della sat on the floor next to Sam, her back against the warming iron, and closed her eyes for a second. That was when she felt it. Not a sound. A give. A half-inch of iron-hot wall behind her shoulder blade that shifted, just slightly, like it wasn't wall at all. She sat up, turned, pressed her palm flat against the wood panelling beside the stove. The same panelling that had been there as long as the cookstove had, painted the same tired forest green as everything else in the cabin. It moved. Not much. A 1/4 inch, maybe less. But wood nailed to a stud for 60 years doesn't move a 1/4 inch for no reason. And Della Mercer, whose hands knew things her mouth couldn't yet say, pressed harder. The panel gave again. Warmer than the wall around it should have been. Warmer than a plank of pine had any business being. In July, with no fire lit an hour ago. She looked down at Sam, still happily assaulting the pot with his spoon, entirely unbothered by the fact that his mother's whole life had just tilted an inch to the left. She looked back at the wall, mind which one stays warm. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. Half hope. Half the specific dread of a woman who's been disappointed by hope before. She didn't have a crowbar. She didn't have a flashlight with working batteries. What she had was a butter knife from the cabin's one drawer, $31, and a boy who needed his dinner in 40 minutes. None of that was going to stop her. Not tonight. Not after that note. She wedged the knife into the seam at the panel's edge. The wood groaned. Old and stubborn. The way everything in that cabin was old and stubborn. The way Hollis himself had been old and stubborn for as long as anyone in Coles Ferry could remember. She worked the knife along the seam, an inch at a time. Dust sifted down from somewhere above the panel, fine and grey. 60 years of it. Sam looked up at the sound. Mama. Dirt, he said, flat and factual, cataloguing the world. I know, baby, Della said. I know. The panel gave another 1/4 inch. Behind it, in the gap, something caught the firelight. Dull. Metallic. She didn't know yet what it was. She wouldn't know for 2 more days, not really. Not the size of it. Not what it would cost her. Not what it would give back. She only knew this much. Her grandfather, a man everyone in 3 counties called Broke, had built something into the wall behind his cookstove. On purpose. With his own 2 hands. And he'd waited until he was dead to tell her which wall to trust. Sam banged the pot again. The fire popped. Somewhere out past the pines, an owl called once and went quiet. Della Mercer knelt on the floor of the cabin nobody wanted. In the dark, prying at a wall her family had laughed about that morning, she did not stop. The panel came free a little after 10 that night. Sam was long asleep by then, curled on the cabin's one cot under Della's coat. She'd worked the knife by lamplight, patient, careful, the way she stocked a pallet and one shelf at a time. The panel was a full board, cut clean, not broken. Someone had built it to be opened. Behind it sat a metal box, soldered shut, the size of a bread loaf warm to the touch from the fire. Stamped on its lid, faint under 60 years of dust, were 3 letters. H. J. M. Hollis James Mercer. Della sat back on her heels and looked at it a long time before she touched it again. She didn't have tools to open a soldered box. She had a 2-year-old asleep 4 feet away and a shift at the thriftway starting at 11 the next morning. She wrapped the box in a dish towel, set it on the kitchen table where she could see it, and did not sleep. In the morning, she drove into Coles Ferry, with Sam buckled in the back and the box on the passenger seat. She stopped at the one place in town that still fixed things instead of throwing them away. Sutter's Small Engine and Repair sat 2 doors down from the thriftway, a low tin building, a hand-painted sign, a dog asleep in the doorway. Walt Sutter had framed half the houses on the north side of Coles Ferry before his knees gave out. After that, he'd fixed chainsaws and lawnmowers. Twice a year, he'd weld whatever the county needed. Cheap. Work no real shop would touch for that price. He'd also worked construction beside Hollis Mercer for 30 years. Della had known that her whole life. She just never once thought about what it meant. "Walt," she said, setting the box on his workbench between a carburetor and a coffee can of loose screws. "Can you open this without wrecking what's inside?" Walt wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't been cleaned since some administration or other. He looked at the box a long moment before he touched it. "Where'd you get this?" "Behind the stove. In the cabin." Something moved across his face. Fast, there and gone. "Behind the stove," he repeated, like he was checking the words fit right. "Grandpa left me a note. Said mind which wall stays warm." Walt set down his coffee. That, more than anything, told Della this was not nothing. "I need my glasses," he said. He came back wearing them and turned the box under the shop light like a man reading a signature. He ran his thumb along the seam where the solder had been laid. "That's his bead," Walt said quietly. "Look how it runs. Even, no drips. Tight in the corner, like he was closing a boat hull. Not a bread box. Hollis welded like other men signed their name. I'd know his hand in the dark." "You're sure?" "Girl, I watched that man run a bead for 30 years. This is Hollis Mercer's work. Nobody else's." He said it out loud in his shop. The dog watched from the doorway. Sam slept in his car seat by the door. Something in Della's chest loosened that she hadn't known was tight. Walt worked the seam with a heat gun. Slow, careful, respectful of whatever was inside. The lid came free a little after noon. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, sat a stack of bonds. Old paper bearer bonds, the kind nobody used anymore. Each one worth $1,000 printed right on its face. There were 40 of them. Walt whistled low. Della didn't say anything at all. Underneath the bonds sat a smaller tin, a biscuit tin. Inside that, a brass key with a tag tied on in string. On the tag, in Hollis's crabbed hand, Panhandle State Bank, Box 114. Under the tin, folded twice, sat a single sheet of paper. Della's hands shook too hard to unfold it right away. "That's a lot of money for a man everybody in this county called broke," Walt said. "That's what I'm thinking," Della said. She unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a photocopy of a deed. Old, county stamped. Dated the week Della was born, 23 years ago. It granted 80 acres of standing timber on Forest Road 9, tax parcel 09-114. To Della Ann Mercer. In perpetuity. Della Ann Mercer. Her name. Filed the week she was born. Not the cabin. The cabin sat on maybe 2 of those acres. The other 78 ran back into pine forest the family had always assumed belonged to the estate, to the house on Larkin Street, to Glenn and Carol now, along with everything else. "Walt," Della said, "this says the land's already mine. Not the estate's. Mine. Since I was a baby." Walt took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. For a second he looked older than she'd ever seen him. "Hollis never said a word," he said. 30 years working beside that man, and he never said one word. Why would he file it and never tell anyone? Walt didn't answer right away. He looked at the bonds, the key, the deed, the whole quiet architecture of it laid out on his workbench. Then he said, slow, working something out as he spoke it. Man like Hollis, he didn't trust easy. Something happened with this family a long time back. Before your time. I don't know the whole of it. But he started buying up timber parcels quiet, in cash, back when land out here went for nothing. Never once told a soul what he was worth. Called himself broke his whole life. Wore the same coat 20 years. Why? Because broke men don't get robbed, Walt said. That's my guess. You want the honest one? Della looked down at the deed with her name on it. 23 years old. She thought about the dollar bill fluttering to the floor in Frank Ostrander's office. She thought about the sound of Glenn and Carol laughing. Something cold and clear settled into her chest where the panic used to live. There's a name penciled inside the lid of the tin, Walt said, turning it over. Marie. Della looked. Small, faded in pencil. Someone had written Marie inside the lid, years ago, and underlined it twice. Grandma, Della said. That was Grandma's name. Hollis's wife had died when Della was 6. Della barely remembered her. Just a smell of lavender soap, and a voice that sang low when it thought no one was listening. He built this for her, Walt said. Or for you. Maybe both. A man doesn't solder a box shut and write a woman's name inside it for no reason. Della sat with that a long moment. 40 bearer bonds, a safe deposit key, a deed to 80 acres that had never belonged to anyone but her. Not even on paper. Not for one day of her life, though nobody, including her, had ever known it. I need to know what the bonds are worth, she said. And what's in that safe deposit box? And I need to not tell Glenn any of this until I know exactly what I'm dealing with. Walt nodded slowly. Smart, he said. You always were the smart one in that family. Nobody ever gave you credit for it. They didn't have to notice for it to be true, Della said. It came out steadier than she expected. She drove to the Thriftway that afternoon, 4 hours late for her shift. The bonds and the key sat locked in the sedan's trunk under a blanket. Her manager docked her pay and didn't ask why. Della didn't tell him. Some things you kept until you knew their weight. That night back at the cabin, she lit the stove again, out of habit now more than cold. She sat at the table with the deed spread flat under the lamp, reading her own name over and over. Della Ann Mercer. Della Ann Mercer. Like saying it enough times would make the ground under her feel solid. Sam slept. The fire held steady. Outside, the pines stood the way they'd stood for 100 years, patient, indifferent, guarding whatever else they'd been asked to guard. She didn't know yet that in 6 days, Glenn Mercer would drive out to that cabin himself for the first time in a decade, not to check on her, because a man from a company called Holloway Pines, LLC, had called his house that morning. He'd asked about finalising the parcel. Glenn, confused, had said, "What parcel?" The man on the phone had gone very quiet. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the wall behind the stove had been warm for a reason. Now she understood the reason. Understanding it had changed the shape of everything. Quietly, in the dark. The rest of her family slept easy in a house that had never really been the whole of what Hollis Mercer left behind. The next morning she called in sick to the Thriftway for the first time in 2 years. She told Sam they were going on an adventure, and he believed her the way 2-year-olds believe anything said with enough enthusiasm. She drove the 40 minutes to Sandpoint. The branch of Panhandle State Bank there still kept a safe deposit vault in the basement. She clenched the brass key so tight in her fist, it left a mark on her palm. The teller was a young man, barely older than Della. He took one look at the key and the box number and asked her to wait. He came back with an older woman, silver-haired, name tag reading Louise. 31 years with the bank, pinned under it, like a badge of honour. Box 114, Louise said, reading the tag on the key. Haven't opened that one in longer than I've worked here. Belonged to Hollis Mercer. You family? Granddaughter, Della said. He left me the key. Louise studied her a moment, the way small-town bank employees study everyone, like she was checking whether this face matched a story she already half knew. You're the one who kept driving out to that cabin, she said. My sister lives on Forest Road, sees your car go by every Sunday. Della hadn't known anyone was keeping track. Yes, Mum, that's me. Well, Louise said, something softening in her face. Let's see what he left you. They walked down narrow stairs into a vault room that smelled like cold metal and dust. Rows of small brass doors lined the wall, like a wall of secrets waiting for the right key. Louise found 114, inserted the bank's master key alongside Della's, and turned both at once. The long metal drawer slid free with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Inside the drawer sat a single folder, cardboard gone soft at the corners, tied shut with butcher's string. Nothing else. No gold, no jewels. Just paper, and the string, and Della's own hands trembling as she untied it. Louise stepped back to give her room. I'll be upstairs, she said quietly, and left Della alone in the vault with the drawer open and the folder in her lap. Inside were 3 things. First, a life insurance policy, paid in full, decades old. It named Della Ann Mercer sole beneficiary. Face value, $100,000, taken out the same year as the deed. Second, a stack of receipts, rubber banded. Everyone marked Bonner County Treasurer. Property tax, parcel 09-114. Paid in full every single year, for 23 years, in cash, by a man who told everyone in town he was broke. Third, an envelope with her name on it in Hollis's hand. Not Della. Della Ann. Written the way you write a name you mean fully. She opened it. Della girl. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you finally found the warm wall. I bought that land the year you were born. I looked at your mother's situation. I looked at this family. And I knew, the way you know weather coming, that someday somebody here would try to take everything from somebody who couldn't fight back. I built this so it couldn't be touched. Not by Glenn, not by a lawyer, not by anybody but you. Your grandmother Marie used to say I loved in secret, because I didn't trust myself to love out loud. She was probably right. I never told you I was proud of you. Every Sunday you drove out and swept that floor for a dead man's ghost. I'm telling you now, mind the warm wall, mind the land. And when they come for it, and they will come, make them read every word out loud, in front of the whole town. That's the only kind of justice men like Glenn ever understand. I love you. I always did. I just built it into a wall instead of saying it, because that's the only language I ever trusted. Grandpa. Della sat in the vault a long time after that. She pressed the letter flat against her chest, the way she'd pressed the deed the night before. She let herself cry, quietly. It was the first time since the will reading, since the dollar bill hit the floor, since anyone had told her something true about her own worth. When she came back upstairs, Louise didn't ask. She just handed Della a tissue from behind the counter and said, "Your grandfather came in here every single quarter for 23 years, paid his taxes in cash, counted twice, thanks me by name, never once mentioned a granddaughter. But he had your school photo taped inside his desk calendar. I saw it every year he renewed the box." "You knew him," Della said. "Everybody in this town knew Hollis Mercer," Louise said. "Nobody knew him well. That was his choice, I think. Some men build their whole lives so nobody can take anything from them. The cost is nobody gets close enough to know what they're worth." Della drove home with Sam asleep in the back seat, the folder locked in the glove box. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She needed to know exactly what she had before she said a word to Glenn. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated. She knew, with that particular clarity, that the moment she showed her hand, the fight would start in earnest. It started 4 days later, faster than she expected. She was at the cabin on a Wednesday evening. Sam was splashing in a plastic tub she'd filled from the well pump. A black pickup came grinding up Forest Road 9, kicking gravel, and stopped hard in front of the cabin. Glenn Mercer got out. He didn't look like a man visiting family. He looked like a man who'd had a bad phone call. Della. He didn't say hello. "We need to talk about the land." "What land, Glenn? Don't play dumb." "The parcel. The 80 acres out here." Glenn's jaw worked. "I got a call today from some outfit, Holloway Pines. They say they've had an option on this land for 2 years. Ready to close. I told them the estate owns it." The man laughed at me. Said the estate's never owned 1 square foot of it. Said the deed's been in your name since you were a baby. Della didn't answer right away. She dried her hands on her jeans, slow, deliberate. "That's right," she finally said. "That's right. That's right." Glenn's voice climbed. "You knew this whole time. You let us divide up an estate that was never yours to divide?" "I found out 4 days ago, Glenn, in the wall behind the stove. In the cabin you and Carol laughed about at the reading. That landed." She watched it land. Something flickered behind his eyes, the specific panic of a man realizing the ground he stood on belonged to someone else. "That's not possible," Glenn said. "Quieter now. Dad wouldn't do that. He'd have told me. I was the one who took care of him." "You took care of him for 4 years, Della said. I drove out here every Sunday for 11. Since I was 12 years old, Glenn. Since before you ever came around." Glenn's face went through several things at once. Anger, confusion, something that might have been shame if he'd let it stay long enough to name. "That land's worth a fortune," he said. "Holloway's talking about a resort development, lakefront access through the back 40. They already put money down on the option, Della. There are contracts. Carol already..." He stopped himself. "Carol already what?" Glenn didn't answer. "Carol already spent the option money," Della said slowly. "Didn't she?" "That's not your business. It became my business the day you laughed at a dollar bill." Della's voice didn't shake. That surprised her more than it surprised him. "I need you to leave now, Glenn. Sam's bath is getting cold." Glenn stood there a moment longer. For just a second, Della saw something almost like fear cross his face. Fast. There and gone. The same look Walt had had in his shop, for a different reason entirely. "This isn't over," Glenn said, and got back in the truck and left gravel dust hanging in the evening air behind him. Della stood in the yard, a long time after the taillights disappeared. Sam called from the tub that the water was cold. Grandpa's letter sat folded in her back pocket now, where she'd started keeping it. She thought about the line he'd written, "Make them read every word out loud, in front of the whole town." She picked Sam up out of the tub, wrapped him in a towel gone thin from years of washing, carried him inside past the warm iron stove and the panel that still hung open an inch. For the first time since the reading, she thought maybe she wasn't the one who'd been left with nothing. Maybe she was the one left with everything that mattered. It had just taken her family a little longer to notice. That night she called Frank Ostrander's office. She left a message asking for a copy of the full estate inventory. Every asset, every account, every signature. She wanted to see, in black and white, exactly what Glenn and Carol believed they'd already spent. She had a feeling, the same feeling, that had made her check a warm wall in July. The numbers wouldn't add up the way Glenn thought they would. For once in her life, Della Mercer was going to be the one asking the questions, instead of absorbing the answers. Frank Ostrander called back 2 days later, and he didn't sound like a man delivering good news. "Della," he said, "I pulled the full inventory, like you asked, and I want you to sit down." "I'm sitting," she said. She wasn't. She was standing at the cabin's one window, watching Sam stack pine cones on the porch step. "But some things you said anyway." "The estate inventory I filed at the reading was based on documents Glenn provided," Frank said. "Bank statements, the house appraisal, the vehicle titles." "I trusted it. I had no reason not to. But you asking about the timber parcel made me pull the original county records myself. Not just take what Glenn's people gave me. And parcel 09-114 was never part of Hollis's estate," Frank said. "It's been recorded in your name since the year you were born, exactly like the deed in your box says, which means the entire estate inventory I read at that table was wrong. Not by a little, by the biggest asset in it." Della sat down for real then. On the porch step next to Sam, who handed her a pine cone like it was the most important gift in the world. "There's more," Frank said. "I ran the numbers on the accounts too while I was in there. Glenn told me at the reading that the estate's bank accounts held around $60,000 combined. I pulled Panhandle State Bank's records this morning. Hollis's primary account held $471,000 the week he died. $471,000. Glenn's known about that account for months," Frank said. "He had power of attorney the last year of Hollis's life. He drew down significant sums before Hollis passed. I have the withdrawal history in front of me right now." Della looked out at the pines. Sam pressed another pine cone into her hand. "How much did he take?" $118,000, Frank said. "In the final 8 months. In increments under 10,000, which is the reporting threshold for suspicious activity. That's not automatically illegal, Della. Power of attorney can authorise spending for the principal's care. But I've seen the pattern before, and this isn't it. Nursing care for Hollis in that period totaled $6,000. The rest went somewhere else. Where, I don't know yet. But a truck like the one Glenn's driving now didn't come from nowhere. Neither did that lake cabin in Priest River Carroll's been posting online." Della thought about the black pickup grinding up the road 4 days ago. Brand new, the kind of truck that cost more than she made in 2 years at the Thriftway. "What do I do with this, Frank?" "For now, nothing dramatic," Frank said. "I want to build the file properly first. Bank records, the power of attorney documents, the withdrawal history, a certified copy of your parcel deed and the life insurance policy. When we go to the probate court to correct the inventory, and we will need to, I want it airtight. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks." Della looked at the cabin, at the panel still hanging open. Sam was now attempting to eat a pine cone, despite 4 documented previous failures at the same task. "Okay," she said. 2 weeks. She hung up and sat there a long moment. Something shifted inside her. She didn't have a word for yet. Not triumph. Not quite anger either. Something steadier than both. Closer to finally seeing the whole shape of a thing she'd only ever felt the edges of. The next Sunday, Walt Sutter drove out to the cabin unannounced. His old truck rattled up the gravel, a toolbox in the bed. He had the look of a man who'd been thinking hard about something. "Brought you a present," he said, and pulled a genuine crowbar and a proper flashlight out of the truck bed. "Figured a butter knife wasn't going to cut it for round 2. "Round 2? You think that's the only thing Hollis built into this place? Walt looked up at the tin roof, at the lean-to, at the whole modest structure with new eyes. Man builds one hidden panel. He's usually not done. I helped him re-roof this place back in '06. There's a crawl space under the lean-to floor nobody's opened in my memory. Della felt her pulse pick up. Show me. They worked through the afternoon together. Walt pried up the lean-to's floorboards. Della kept Sam entertained with a stick and an anthill. Sure enough, under the third board from the wall sat a trapdoor no bigger than a doormat, hinged with the same careful hand as the panel behind the stove. Inside, wrapped in a horse blanket, sat a metal strongbox, and inside that, a second folder. This one held photographs. Dozens of them, black and white, going back decades. Hollis as a young man in work clothes, standing in front of buildings Della didn't recognise. A filling station, a hardware store, a diner. Each one dated and labelled on the back, in his careful hand. What is this? Della said, spreading them across the lean-to floor. Walt studied one, then another. His face changed as he worked through the years. These are the properties, he said slowly, the ones from before he got quiet about money. I remember him talking about these places, way back, before you were born. He used to loan people money to get started. Small stuff. 100 here, 500 there. Half of Coles Ferry owed Hollis Mercer a favour at one point or another. Grandpa was a lender. Grandpa was the kind of man who helped people quietly and never mentioned it again. Walt said. Something happened, somewhere along the way, that made him stop letting people know he had money. But he never stopped having it. He just got better at hiding it. At the bottom of the photograph sat one more page, typed this time, not handwritten. A list of names and dollar amounts, dozens of entries, dating back 30 years. Next to each name, a single word, forgiven. He forgave the debts, Della said quietly. All of them. Everyone, Walt said, reading down the list. Look here. Sutter Walter. $400. 1997. Forgiven. Della looked up at him. He loaned you money? Walt's jaw tightened. For a moment he didn't answer. The year my youngest was born early, he finally said. Hospital bills nearly broke us. Hollis showed up at my door with an envelope. Never once brought it up again. I tried to pay him back for years. He always said the account was settled. He looked down at his own name typed there. Forgiven. 27 years later. Guess now I know for sure. Della sat back against the lean-to wall, photographs spread around her, like a map of a life she'd never fully seen. Her grandfather, the man everyone called broke, had spent decades quietly rebuilding half the town, one small loan at a time, telling no one, expecting nothing back. He died letting his own son believe there was nothing left to steal, because there was nothing visible to steal. He hid it so well even the people he helped didn't know how rich he really was, Della said. He hid it so well his own son's going to jail, trying to steal money that was never really there to steal, Walt said. Not the way Glenn thinks it's there anyway. The real money was always locked up where Glenn couldn't reach it. He's been fighting you over table scraps. Della looked down at the list of forgiven debts, then back at the deed with her name on it, then at the letter that told her to make them read every word out loud. Something settled into place in her mind. Clean. Cold. Entirely certain. She wasn't just going to correct an inventory anymore. She was going to make sure the whole town of Coles Ferry understood exactly who Hollis Mercer had really been, and exactly what her uncle had tried to take from a dead man's carefully built quiet. That night, after Sam was asleep, she sat at the cabin table and started writing out everything Frank would need. Every date, every name, every dollar. She worked until the lamp oil ran low. When she finally lay down next to Sam on the narrow cot, she fell asleep faster than she had in weeks. The deed, the letter, and the list of forgiven debts sat locked safe in the strongbox beside her, waiting for the day she'd carry them into a room full of people who thought they already knew how this story ended. The 2 weeks Frank asked for turned into 11 days. Glenn Mercer did not wait quietly. On a Tuesday morning, a certified letter arrived at the Thriftway, addressed to Della, care of her employer. That alone told her something. Someone wanted her rattled before she'd even opened it. Inside was a petition. Glenn and Carol Mercer, through a lawyer named Roy Dunmore out of Sandpoint, were contesting the 09-114 deed. They claimed Hollis had been of diminished capacity in his final years. They claimed any transfer outside the estate was undue influence, presumably Della's. Della read it twice at the break room table. Her hand stayed steady even when her stomach didn't. Diminished capacity. she said out loud, to no one. He was sharp enough to solder a bread box shut and hide a deed for 23 years. Not sharp enough to know his own land. Her co-worker Rosa, who'd worked the register longer than Della had been alive, leaned over and read the top line. "That your uncle?" "That's my uncle." Rosa made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "Honey, my grandmother always said the ones who show up last for the funeral show up first for the money. Want my advice?" "Always." "Don't get loud," Rosa said. "Loud people lose in front of judges. Quiet people with paperwork win." "You got paperwork?" Della thought of the strongbox, the folder, the list of forgiven debts, the letter in Hollis's own hand. "I've got paperwork," she said. She called Frank from the parking lot before her shift. He sounded, for the first time since she'd known him, almost pleased. "Good," he said when she read him the petition. "Now he's committed to a story in writing. Diminished capacity is hard to prove, and it's about to get harder. I finished the withdrawal records this morning. I want to show you in person. Can you come tomorrow?" She could. She dropped Sam with Rosa's sister, who ran a small daycare out of her garage for $6 an hour. The woman never once asked why Della was suddenly so busy. Della drove into Frank's office with the strongbox riding on the passenger seat, like a second passenger. Frank spread 3 documents across his desk. First, he said, the power of attorney Hollis signed, 18 months before he died. It's valid. Nobody disputes that. Glenn had legal authority to manage his father's finances. Okay. Second, the withdrawal log, $118,000 over 8 months, structured in amounts just under the reporting threshold. On its own, that doesn't prove theft, but it raises questions, especially paired with this. He slid over the 3rd page. Third, a vehicle purchase agreement. Glenn bought a $41,000 truck 4 months before Hollis died. Financed through a dealership in Coeur d'Alene. The down payment was $18,000. It came from a cashier's check drawn on Hollis's account. The same week. Della looked at the number. $18,000. The exact down payment on the truck that had ground up her gravel road like a threat. He bought his truck with Grandpa's money, she said. It appears that way, Frank said. Careful, lawyer, careful, the way he said everything that mattered. The same week, Carol made a down payment on the Priest River property. $22,000. Cash. No financing. I haven't traced that source yet. I intend to. So Glenn's lawyer files a claim that my grandfather was too confused to know his own mind, Della said slowly. And meanwhile, Glenn was pulling structured cash out of that same confused man's account. To buy a truck. And a lake cabin. That's the shape of it. Yes. Della sat back in the chair. For a long moment she said nothing at all. She just looked at the 3 documents laid out like a hand of cards she hadn't known she was holding. What happens next, she finally said. Next, we don't panic. We don't rush, Frank said. We respond to the petition. We deny the claim. We request a hearing. At the hearing, we present the deed, the tax receipts, 23 years of Hollis paying the parcel taxes himself. The life insurance policy, filed the same week as the deed, showing decades of consistent intent. And if it comes to it, the withdrawal records, the vehicle purchase, and the letter, Della said, the one he wrote me, and the forgiven debts. Frank considered that. The letter, yes, once it's authenticated. Walt Sutter can help there, given he knew the handwriting for 30 years. The forgiven debts list is more delicate. It's powerful. But it's also personal information about a lot of people in this town. People who might not want their old debts read into a public record. Walt already knows his name's on it, Della said. He found the list with me. Then that's one name we can use, if he consents. The rest I'd hold back unless we need them. Sometimes the strongest card is the one you never have to play. Della thought about Hollis's letter. Make them read every word out loud, in front of the whole town. Sitting in Frank's office with the truck's down payment slip in front of her, she finally understood. Her grandfather hadn't been asking for revenge. He'd been asking for the truth to finally be spoken, where everyone could hear it, after decades of choosing quiet. When's the hearing? She asked. Judge Aldous Reyes has an opening in 3 weeks, Frank said. Probate court, Bonner County Courthouse. Open session. Same room where the original will was read, actually. Small county. We don't have a lot of courtrooms to choose from. The same room. Something settled into place at that. A kind of grim symmetry she hadn't asked for, but wasn't about to waste either. Good, she said. Let them file whatever they want. Let them bring their lawyer. I want to stand in that exact room and watch somebody read every one of these numbers out loud. Frank almost smiled. It was the closest she'd ever seen him come to it. That's the spirit that wins these, Della. Not the anger, the patience. She drove back to the cabin that evening with 3 weeks stretched out ahead of her like a long, straight road. For the first time since the will reading, she didn't feel like a woman waiting for the next thing to be taken from her. She felt like a woman getting ready. That night she called Walt. She told him about the hearing, about the letter. She needed his voice in that room, under oath to say the handwriting belonged to Hollis Mercer and no one else. He didn't hesitate. "I'll wear my good shirt," he said. "The one my wife bought me for church. Haven't worn it since her funeral. Feels like the kind of day for it. Thank you, Walt. For all of it. The crowbar. The trapdoor. Believing me from the first minute. Girl, I watched you sweep that cabin floor every Sunday for 11 years, Walt said, his voice gone rough. Nobody asked you to. Nobody thanked you for it. Hollis used to tell me watching you drive up that road from his porch, that you were the only one of his blood who ever came around without wanting something. A man doesn't forget a thing like that. Neither do I." Della sat with that a long moment after they hung up. Sam was asleep against her shoulder. The cabin sat dark except for the stove's dying orange glow. She thought about all the Sundays she'd driven out here expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, just showing up because somebody had to. None of it had been wasted after all. Not 1 mile of that gravel road, not 1 hour of sweeping a dead man's floor. 3 weeks, she thought. 3 weeks, and then Cole's Ferry would hear the whole truth, read out loud. In the same room where they'd once handed her a single dollar and laughed, she banked the stove for the night, the way Hollis had taught her. For once, she slept without dreaming of the dollar bill at all. The morning after the petition arrived, before Della had even called Frank, an envelope showed up wedged in the cabin's screen door. No stamp, no return address, just her name, Della, written in careful block letters on the front. Inside was $200 in worn 20s, and a note in handwriting she didn't recognise. "Heard what your uncle's trying to pull. Your grandfather fixed my truck for free in 1988 when I couldn't pay a dime and told me never to mention it again. Guess I'm mentioning it now. Don't let them grind you down, girl. Cole's Ferry remembers more than people think. No signature." Della stood in the doorway a long moment. The bill sat warm in her hand from the morning sun. Sam tugged at her sleeve, asking for breakfast. She thought about how many small kindnesses her grandfather must have handed out over the decades. Quiet as breathing, never once cashing in the debt. She never found out who left it. She asked around town gently. Over the following weeks, she got only knowing half smiles in return. The particular look of a small town that had decided, together, to keep a secret a little longer. She used $40 on groceries. The rest went in the coffee can on the shelf, next to the one Hollis used to keep his spare nails in. She didn't touch it again until the day of the hearing. Then she folded 2 20s into her jacket pocket alongside the letter. For luck, though, she couldn't have said luck for what exactly. 2 weeks before the hearing, Glenn tried one more thing. He showed up at the Thriftway during Della's shift. Not at the cabin this time. In front of witnesses. Rosa was there, the assistant manager. A whole line of customers waiting to check out. Loud enough for half the store to hear, he asked whether Della wanted to settle this like family before it got expensive for everyone. "Define settle," Della said, not looking up from the register. "Split it," Glenn said. 50-50. The land, whatever's in it. We forget the lawyers, forget the courthouse, keep this out of the papers. Family looks after family. Della finished ringing up the customer in front of her, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Aldrich, watching the whole exchange with sharp, unhidden interest. The kind of look a woman gets after grading far worse behaviour than this for 40 years. "Family looked after family for 11 years every Sunday I drove out to that cabin," Della said, still not raising her voice. "Where was 50-50 then, Glenn?" Glenn's jaw tightened. "That's not the same thing." "No," Della agreed. "It's not. You're offering to split something you have no legal claim to, the week after you found out you don't own it, in the middle of my job, in front of my co-workers. That's not family looking after family. That's a man trying to get a discount on a mistake." Mrs. Aldrich, taking her bagged groceries, said quietly, but not quietly enough. "Sounds like she's already given you your answer, young man." She walked out with the dignity of a woman who'd never once needed to raise her own voice to win an argument either. Glenn left without buying anything. Rosa watched him go and let out a low whistle. "Girl," she said, "you did not even blink. I've had a lot of practice not blinking at that man," Della said. She went back to her register. Her hand stayed steady, heart pounding underneath a calm she'd worked years to build, and had finally this summer learned to trust. That night she told Walt about the Thriftway offer. They sat on the cabin porch while Sam chased fireflies in the last of the light. Walt shook his head slowly. "Man's scared," he said. "Scared men make offers like that. They want it quiet before the truth gets loud." Frank says the same thing. Says every move Glenn makes now is a man trying to put a lid back on something that already boiled over. Frank's right. Walt watched Sam stumble after a firefly and miss, laughing anyway, delighted by the missing as much as he'd have been by the catching. "You know what your grandfather told me the last summer before he passed? Said the measure of a man isn't what he does when things are easy. It's what he does the week he finds out he's about to lose something he thought was already his." "Glenn's failing that test pretty completely," Della said. "Glenn's failing that test in front of the whole county," Walt said. "You're not. That's the difference that's going to matter. Come the hearing." Della thought about that long after Walt drove home. Sam was asleep. She sat with the lamp burning, the letter spread out once more in front of her. She thought about the $200 from a stranger who remembered a kindness nobody had asked to be remembered. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich's quiet verdict in the checkout line. She thought about a whole small town, watching, quietly keeping score, the way small towns always did, whether you wanted them to or not. She wasn't afraid of the hearing anymore. If anything, she was looking forward to it. The particular readiness of a woman who finally had nothing left to hide, and everything left to prove. She knew for the first time in a long time that she could prove every bit of it. The 3 weeks passed the way waiting always does, slow in the days, fast in the sum of them. Della worked her shifts. She kept Sam fed and dry and mostly happy. She drove out to the cabin every evening after the Thriftway closed. She and Walt spent those hours going through the second folder, line by line. They cross-checked names against the county assessor's records. They matched dates on the photographs to dates on the tax receipts. Piece by piece, they built a picture of Hollis Mercer neither of them had fully seen while he was alive. He bought the old Kessler filling station's mortgage in 1989, Walt said one evening. He tapped a photograph of a young Hollis standing in front of a gas pump that hadn't existed in decades. Paid it off quiet so the Kesslers wouldn't lose the place to the bank. Never told them who did it. "I only know because I helped him move the paperwork. Why would he do all that and then act broke his whole life?" Walt was quiet a moment, turning the photograph over in his hands. "I think a man like that gets tired of people wanting something from him the second they know he has it." He finally said, "Easier to be poor in everybody's eyes. Keeps the wanting away. Keeps things simple." "But it wasn't simple," Della said. "It cost him being known, being thanked, being close to anybody." "It cost him that with everybody but you," Walt said. "You're the one he let in, even if it took him dying to say it." Della thought about that most nights after Walt drove home. Sam would be asleep. She'd sit at the cabin table with the lamp burning low, the letter and the deed spread out in front of her, like she was still trying to memorize every word. Frank called twice during those 3 weeks with updates. The first call confirmed it. Roy Dunmore, Glenn's attorney, had filed an amended petition. It added a claim that Della had exercised undue influence over Hollis in his final months. But Della's own visitation logs told a different story. She'd kept them faithfully in a small notebook, never once thinking it would matter. 41 separate Sunday visits, the last year of Hollis's life. 0 visits from Glenn or Carol in that same window. "He's boxing himself in," Frank said. "Every claim he adds, I get to disprove with a document he can't argue with. Keep doing what you're doing." The second call came 4 days before the hearing. This one made Frank's voice tighten in a way Della hadn't heard before. "Carol's source of funds," he said. "The $22,000 for the Priest River down payment. I traced it. It came from a joint account Carol opened with Hollis's name still on it, from before he moved into assisted living. She never removed his name after he passed. She's been drawing on that account for 11 months since his death, using a power of attorney that legally expired the day he did." "That's not the same as the truck money," Della said slowly. "No," Frank said. "The truck withdrawals happened while Hollis was alive, under an active power of attorney. That's a grey area. Arguable, morally ugly, but defensible. This is different. Carol's been accessing a dead man's account for nearly a year, using authority that ended the moment he stopped breathing. That's not grey. That's clean, simple theft from an estate. And I found it because you asked me to look at one small timber parcel." Della sat with the phone against her ear, a long moment, watching the pines go dark with evening. How much did she take? $31,400, Frank said. Since his death, from an account that should have been frozen the day he passed. Della closed her eyes. She thought about Carol touching her pearl earring at the will reading, saying blood tells. Like loyalty was something she'd been born into, not something she'd spent 11 months actively betraying. Does the judge see this at the hearing? The judge sees everything at the hearing, Frank said. That's rather the point. 4 days later, Della drove into Coles Ferry. The sedan's check engine light glowed same as always. Sam sat in his car seat in a clean shirt she'd ironed twice. Walt followed behind in his truck, wearing the good shirt his wife had bought him. The strongbox rode in the trunk, same as it had since the day she'd pulled it out from under the lean-to floor. The Bonner County Courthouse sat 2 blocks off Main Street, a squat brick building, white columns. As a child, it had looked to Della like something out of a picture book. Today it looked smaller than she remembered. Steadier too, the way places sometimes do when you finally walk in with something solid in your hands. Frank met them on the steps, a slim leather case under one arm. Ready? He asked. I've been ready since a dollar bill hit a courthouse floor, Della said. Frank almost smiled again. Twice now in 1 month. For Frank Ostrander, that was practically a parade. Inside, the probate courtroom was smaller than a real courtroom, more like a large meeting hall. A raised bench up front, a scattering of hard wooden chairs, windows letting in the flat grey light of a Bonner County morning. It was, Della realised with a jolt, the exact same room. The same room where Frank had read Hollis's will 6 weeks before. The same room where a dollar bill had fluttered to the floor and no one had bent to pick it up. Glenn and Carol Mercer sat across the aisle, with their attorney, Roy Dunmore. A heavy-set man in an expensive suit, slightly wrong for a county courthouse, like he'd worn it to remind everyone he billed by the hour. Carol's pearl earrings caught the grey light. Glenn wouldn't look at Della at all. A handful of townspeople had come to watch. Small towns do that, when a piece of local history is about to be settled in public. Rosa from the Thriftway sat near the back. Louise from the bank sat 2 rows behind her. Even the county clerk who'd handed Della the recorder's name weeks ago slipped in near the door. Judge Aldous Reyes entered a few minutes later, a lean older man, reading glasses pushed up into grey hair. He called the room to order with the flat efficiency of someone who'd presided over 1,000 small-town disputes. He expected this to be one more. This is a hearing on the petition of Glenn and Carol Mercer, Judge Reyes said, reading from the file, to invalidate the recorded deed transferring parcel 09-114 to Della Ann Mercer, and a related claim of undue influence in the estate of Hollis James Mercer. He looked up. Mr. Dunmore, your petition, please. Roy Dunmore stood. He buttoned his jacket. He began speaking in the confident, practiced tone of a man who'd done this 100 times. He clearly expected the 101st to go exactly the same way. Della sat very still, Sam quiet on her lap for once. He sensed, without understanding, that something important was happening around him. For the first time in 6 weeks, Della felt something new. Not fear, not grief, not even anger. She felt ready. Behind her sat Walt in his good shirt. Beside her sat Frank, his slim leather case resting against his knee. Inside that case sat every document that would, before this hearing ended, turn Roy Dunmore's confident opening statement into something considerably harder to say with a straight face. Outside the tall windows, the same grey Bonner County light fell over the same town square, the one where Della had once counted $31 twice in a parking lot. Not because the number changed, because hope sometimes asked for a recount. She wasn't counting anymore. She knew exactly what she had. 10 days before the hearing, Frank asked Della to bring the bonds and the deed in for a formal appraisal. The court would need a certified number, not a guess. The appraiser's name was Edwin Marsh, a soft-spoken man out of Spokane who specialised in timberland and old paper instruments. He set up in Frank's conference room with a jeweler's loupe, a laptop, and the unhurried patience of a man who didn't like to be rushed through numbers that mattered. He examined the 40 bearer bonds first, checking serial numbers against a registry on his laptop, murmuring dates and denominations to himself. Della sat across the table with Sam on her lap, trying not to fidget, while a stranger decided, methodically, what her grandfather's secret had actually been worth. These are legitimate, Marsh finally said. Older instrument, matured decades ago but redeemable. Combined face and accrued value, given the maturity date, comes to just over $61,000. Della exhaled. $61,000. More money than she had ever held at once in her life. And the timber, Marsh said, moving to a folder of maps and survey data, Frank had pulled from the county. 80 acres, mixed lodgepole and larch, mature stand, no recent harvest. Bonner County timber values have climbed sharply the last 5 years, mostly on lumber demand out of the coast. I put standing timber value alone at $310,000, conservatively. He kept going. This was the part where his careful voice finally, briefly, faltered. There's also mineral interest attached to this parcel I wasn't expecting, Marsh said, scrolling through a county filing. A small gravel and aggregate lease, recorded 11 years ago, currently paying quarterly royalties to the parcel owner. That's been accruing, unclaimed because nobody at the county had a current address on file for the owner. It looks like roughly $41,000 is sitting in escrow, waiting for someone to claim it. The room went quiet. Even Frank looked briefly surprised, and Frank did not surprise easily anymore. Waiting for someone, Della repeated slowly. Waiting for you, Marsh said. You're the owner of record. Have been the whole time. Della sat very still. Sam patted her cheek gently, oblivious. She did the arithmetic the only way she knew how, the way she'd learned counting quarters, and $31 twice in a parking lot, $61,000 in bonds, $310,000 in standing timber, $41,000 sitting forgotten in a county escrow account. That's over $400,000, she said, for land my family thought was worth nothing. For land your family didn't know existed, legally speaking, Marsh corrected gently. There's a difference. Nothing about this was worthless. It was simply invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. Frank made a note on his legal pad. I want your written appraisal for the hearing, Mr. Marsh. All 3 figures, itemised, with your credentials attached. You'll have it by Friday, Marsh said, closing his laptop. He looked at Della for a moment, the way a man looks at something he's just finished carefully measuring. Can I ask you something? Off the record? Sure. Did you know any of this before you found the deed? Della thought about $31 in a parking lot, about a butter knife working as a warm wall in July, about a note that said mind which one stays warm, and nothing else. I didn't know a single dollar of it, she said. I only knew my grandfather told me to check a wall. I did it because he asked, not because I expected anything. Marsh nodded slowly, the way a man nods at something that confirms a private theory he's held a long time. In my experience, he said, packing his loop away, the people who end up holding the real value are almost never the ones who went looking for it. They're the ones who kept a promise nobody was watching them keep. He left a few minutes later. Frank sat back in his chair, looking at Della with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. $412,000, he said, give or take. That's what's coming to you, separate and apart from anything in the original estate. And Glenn and Carol built their entire case on the idea that this parcel was worth nothing at all. They built their whole case on a lot of things that weren't true, Della said. They're about to find that out in front of a judge, Frank said, in a room full of people who've known your family 30 years. They'll remember every word of it. Della drove home that evening, with the appraisal report on the seat beside her. $412,000, typed cleanly across the summary page. She thought about the dollar bill fluttering to the courthouse floor, about Glenn's grin, about Carol touching her pearl earring, saying blood tells like it settled something. Blood hadn't settled anything. A soldered box behind a cook stove had settled it. 23 years before anyone in that room had the decency to ask what her grandfather was really worth. She got home before dark, banked the stove out of habit, sat with Sam on the porch step, watching the light go gold over the pines. For the first time, she let herself imagine, just for a moment, what the cabin might look like with a new roof. A real bed, a life built on solid ground instead of borrowed time. 3 days until the hearing. She was, for the first time since the will reading, not counting down with dread. She was counting down the way you count down to something you've already won, simply waiting for the world to catch up and agree with her. The morning of the hearing, Della woke before dawn out of habit. The old habit of a woman who'd spent years rising early for shifts nobody thanked her for. She lay in the dark, listening to Sam's soft breathing on the cot beside her. She'd laid her clothes out the night before. The one good blouse she owned, ironed twice. Sam's small collared shirt hung from a nail by the window, like a tiny flag. She got up quiet, banked the stove's last coals for warmth, and made coffee in the same dented percolator Hollis had used every morning of his life that she remembered. She drank it standing at the window, watching the pines go from black to grey to green as the light came up. She thought, unexpectedly, not about Glenn or Carol or the hearing at all. She thought about the first Sunday she'd ever driven out here alone. 14 years old, borrowed keys in her pocket. No particular reason except that somebody had to. She hadn't known, that Sunday, what she was building toward. She just knew the floor needed sweeping, and nobody else was going to do it. Funny, she thought, how a life sometimes turns out to be made of exactly the small things you never once thought were adding up to anything. She woke Sam gently at 7, dressed him in the little shirt, fed him oatmeal at the same table where the deed and the letter had first come to light. She found herself talking to him the whole time, low and easy, the way she always did, even though he was 2, and understood maybe every 5th word. Today somebody's going to say a lot of things about Grandpa that aren't true, she told him, buttoning his shirt, and then some other people are going to stand up and say the things that are true instead. That's mostly what a courtroom is, baby. A room where the truth finally gets its turn to talk. Sam patted her cheek and said, "Truck," which was his answer to most sentences that summer. Della laughed for the first time all morning, a real laugh. Something in her chest loosened just slightly before the day even properly began. Roy Dunmore's opening statement ran 12 minutes. Della counted them, one by one, the way she used to count quarters. Not because the number would change. Counting steadied her hands. "Your Honour," Dunmore said, pacing a few careful steps in front of the bench, "the evidence will show that Hollis James Mercer, in his final 18 months, suffered a documented cognitive decline. During this vulnerable period, his granddaughter engineered the transfer of the estate's single most valuable asset into her own name. She isolated him from the family members who had faithfully cared for him. She concealed the existence of this parcel until after his death." He said, isolating with real weight, like the word alone should do most of his work for him. Della kept her face still. She thought about 41 Sunday visits, logged in a small notebook, and 0 visits from the man now accusing her of isolation. "We will further show," Dunmore continued, "that Miss Mercer's own financial desperation, evidenced by her minimum wage employment and status as a single mother, gave her clear motive to exploit an elderly man's declining faculties." Frank leaned over slightly. "He just told the judge you're poor and desperate, like that's a crime," he murmured. "Watch how fast that backfires." Judge Reyes made a small note and looked up. "Thank you, Mr. Dunmore. Ms. Mercer's counsel, your response." Frank Ostrander stood, unhurried. He wore the same modest grey suit he wore to file paperwork on ordinary Tuesdays. Della understood, watching him, that this was deliberate too. A man who let the documents perform instead of the theatrics. "Your Honour, I'd like to begin not with argument but with dates," Frank said. "The deed transferring parcel 09-114 to Della Ann Mercer was recorded with Bonner County on March 14th, 23 years ago. That is the week of Della Mercer's birth. Not 18 months ago. Not during any period of claimed cognitive decline. Hollis Mercer was 51 years old that year, in excellent health, gainfully self-employed by his own tax filings. He placed the certified deed copy on the exhibit table. The petitioner's own filing describes a man too impaired to know his own mind 18 months before his death," Frank went on, "but this document predates that claimed impairment by more than 2 decades. I'd ask the court to note that fact. It undermines the entire premise of the petition." Judge Reyes examined the deed a long moment. "Noted, Mr. Ostrander. Continue." Frank did, methodically, without raising his voice once. He walked the court through the tax receipts. 23 consecutive years, each one paid in cash, each one signed by Hollis Mercer personally, well before and well after any claim decline. He introduced the life insurance policy, filed the same week as the deed, naming the same beneficiary. A consistent decision made across 2 decades. Not a sudden late life mistake. Then he called Walt Sutter to the stand. Walt walked up in his good shirt, hands folded in front of him like a man at church. He was sworn in. He answered Frank's questions in a voice gone rough with feeling, but it never once wavered. "Mr. Sutter, how long did you know Hollis Mercer?" 31 years. Worked construction beside him most of that time. "Do you recognise this handwriting?" Frank held up the note that had come with the dollar bill and the letter from the tin box. Walt studied both. "That's Hollis's hand. I'd know it anywhere. Same as this welded seam here." He gestured at a photograph of the soldered box. Man welded like he wrote. Careful and even. No wasted motion. That's his work. All of it. And in your professional opinion, formed over 3 decades working alongside Mr. Mercer. Did he show any signs of diminished capacity in his final years? None, Walt said flatly. Sharpest man I knew right up to the end. Could tell you the going rate on lumber before the yard could. Man like that doesn't lose his mind. He just gets tired of showing it to people who never asked. A small ripple went through the gallery. Rosa, near the back, made a soft sound of agreement. Even the county clerk nodded slightly, like something private had just been confirmed for her. Roy Dunmore stood for cross-examination. He tried for several minutes to suggest that Walt's long friendship with Hollis made his testimony biased, unreliable, a friend's flattery, not an expert opinion. Walt answered every question the same way. Plain, unbothered. By the end, Dunmore sat back down, looking like a man who'd expected an easier witness. Judge Reyes called a 15-minute recess before the next phase of testimony, and the gallery shuffled out into the hallway, murmuring, while Della stayed in her seat with Sam stirring against her shoulder. Rosa found her in the hallway anyway, pressing a granola bar into Della's hand like it was medicine. That lawyer of yours is good, Rosa said, quiet as a church mouse and twice as deadly. You picked right. Frank's not done, Della said. He told me there's more. More? Rosa's eyebrows went up. Honey, what else could there possibly be? Della didn't answer because she wasn't entirely sure herself how the next part would land, only that Frank had warned her it would land hard, and that once it did, there would be no version of this family that looked the same afterward. Walt found them a moment later, still in his good shirt, looking pleased in the quiet, contained way of a man who'd just done something that mattered and didn't need anyone to tell him so. You did real good up there, Della told him. Just told the truth, Walt said. Easiest thing in the world when you've got nothing to hide. He glanced toward the courtroom doors, where Glenn and Carol stood apart from everyone else. Carol's arms crossed tight, Glenn staring at the floor like it owed him an explanation. Don't look like the truth's been quite so easy on them today. It's about to get harder, Della said quietly. The bailiff called them back in a few minutes later. Della settled Sam against her shoulder. Frank's slim leather case rested against his knee, one folder still unopened inside it, waiting to see daylight. She took her seat as Judge Reyes re-entered, and the room went quiet again. Mr. Ostrander, the judge said, you indicated there was an additional matter. Frank stood. There is, Your Honour, he said, and I'll ask the court's patience because it concerns not the deed alone, but the full conduct of this estate's administration since Hollis Mercer's death. Your Honour, I'd like to introduce financial records relevant to the administration of this estate, Frank said. Obtained through subpoena of Panhandle State Bank. Della watched Roy Dunmore's posture change for the first time all morning. A small stiffening, the posture of a man who hadn't expected this door to open in this room. Objection, Dunmore said. This is a hearing on a single deed, not a full accounting of the estate. It's directly relevant to the petitioner's credibility and motive, Your Honour, Frank said, calm as ever. The petition alleges my client acted out of desperation to defraud a vulnerable elder. I intend to show the court exactly who in this room was actually drawing down that vulnerable elder's accounts, and when, and why. Judge Reyes considered this a moment, glasses catching the grey light. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Ostrander. Carefully. Frank laid out the withdrawal log first. $118,000, structured in amounts under the reporting threshold, drawn by Glenn Mercer, under a power of attorney, during the final 8 months of Hollis's life. Then the vehicle purchase agreement. The $18,000 down payment on Glenn's new truck, dated the same week as one of the structured withdrawals. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Glenn's face had gone the colour of old paper. Mr. Mercer used his father's own funds, Frank said, to purchase a personal vehicle, 4 months before his father's death, while simultaneously petitioning this court to claim that same father was too cognitively impaired to make a simple, decades-old decision about a piece of land. Glenn half rose from his chair. That money was for his care, that was, Mr. Mercer. Please remain seated unless called, Judge Reyes said. Not unkindly, but firmly. Glenn sat, jaw tight. Carol's hand suddenly gripped his sleeve. There's one more matter, Your Honour, Frank said. Even his calm voice carried something sharper now, the sound of a door about to open on the room's last secret. Regarding funds accessed after Mr. Mercer's death. Carol's face, for the first time all morning, lost its careful composure. A joint account existed, under Hollis Mercer's name, co-signed by Carol Mercer, established before his admission to assisted living, Frank said. Following Mr. Mercer's death, this account should have been frozen pending estate administration. Instead, bank records show 11 separate withdrawals over 11 months, totaling $31,400, made by Carol Mercer, using a power of attorney that had legally expired the moment Hollis Mercer passed away. The gallery made a sound now, a low collective murmur. Judge Reyes lifted one hand to settle the room. $22,000 of that withdrawn amount, Frank continued. Matches, dollar for dollar. The cash down payment on a lakefront property in Priest River, purchased in Carol Mercer's name, 4 months after her father-in-law's death. Carol's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Della sat very still, Sam warm and quiet against her chest. She watched her aunt's careful composure come apart in real time. The pearl earrings suddenly looked less like elegance, more like something bought with money that had never belonged to her. Judge Reyes removed his glasses slowly. He looked for a long moment between Glenn, Carol, and their attorney. Then down at the exhibits spread across Frank's table. Mr. Dunmore, the judge said, I'd strongly advise a recess before you decide how you wish to proceed with the remainder of this hearing. Roy Dunmore, for the first time all morning, did not look like a man who had done this 100 times before. He looked like a man who had just realised in front of a full gallery exactly how badly he'd misjudged which side of this room actually held the paperwork. He asked for the recess. Judge Reyes granted it. 20 minutes later, when the room reconvened, Roy Dunmore stood alone at the petitioner's table. Glenn and Carol sat behind him. Not beside him, a small physical distance that told its own story. Your Honour, Dunmore said. For the first time all day, his confident cadence had gone thin. Careful, a man picking his way across ice he no longer trusted. My clients wish to withdraw the petition contesting the validity of the deed to parcel 09-114. A ripple went through the gallery again, sharper this time. They further wish the court to note, Dunmore continued, that they were not previously aware of the extent of, the financial matters raised in the last hour. Judge Reyes regarded him a long moment over his glasses. Mr. Dunmore, are you telling this court your clients had no knowledge of their own bank withdrawals? Dunmore said nothing. There was, Della understood watching him, genuinely nothing left to say. The petition to invalidate the deed is withdrawn, Judge Reyes said. The deed to parcel 09-114 stands as recorded, in the name of Della Ann Mercer, valid since the date of filing, 23 years ago. He made a note. As for the withdrawal records and the post-mortem account activity, this court will refer the matter to the Bonner County Prosecutor's Office for review. A full accounting of the estate is required from the personal representative within 30 days. He looked at Glenn and Carol directly for the first time. I would remind the respondents that misuse of a power of attorney and unauthorised access to a decedent's account are matters this court takes with the utmost seriousness. I expect full cooperation with the accounting order. This hearing is adjourned. He struck the gavel once, a small, unglamorous sound, in a small, unglamorous room. It was, Della thought, the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. The gallery began to murmur and rise. Rosa let out a breath like she'd been holding it the whole hour. Louise from the bank was already whispering to the woman beside her. Walt stood and straightened his good shirt. He looked over at Della with something that might have been pride, if a man like Walt ever let himself wear that word plainly on his face. Della sat still a moment longer. Sam woke against her shoulder, blinking at the room, like he was trying to understand why everyone had suddenly gotten so loud. Across the aisle, Glenn would not look at her. Carol stared straight ahead at nothing, her hand no longer gripping his sleeve. Both of them sat in the wreckage of a version of themselves they'd apparently believed right up until an hour ago. And come here, Frank closed his leather case, the last folder still unopened inside it, unnecessary now, and turned to Della with something almost like a smile. That's it, he said quietly. It's yours. All of it. The land, the deed. By the time that accounting order comes due, likely a great deal of what your uncle and aunt thought they'd already spent. Della stood, shifting Sam onto her hip. For a moment she just looked around the small courtroom. Same windows, same grey light. Same room where a dollar bill had once fluttered to the floor, while a family laughed. Nobody was laughing now. She walked past Glenn and Carol on her way out. She didn't gloat, didn't slow down, didn't say a single triumphant word. Hollis hadn't built any of this so she could win an argument. He'd built it so she'd never again have to ask anyone's permission to be believed. At the door she stopped, just for a second, and looked back at her uncle. He kept every receipt, she said. Not unkindly, just true. 23 years of them. He always meant for the truth to come out eventually. He just wanted it to come out on solid ground, not on somebody's say-so. Glenn didn't answer. Maybe there wasn't an answer left in him. Della turned and walked out into the grey Bonner County afternoon. Sam's small weight sat warm against her hip. Walt and Rosa and Frank fell into step around her, a family assembled not by blood, but by every Sunday she'd ever shown up when nobody asked her to. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the particular, solid relief of a woman who finally, completely, knew exactly where she stood. 3 months later, the pines around the cabin had gone from summer green to the deep, dusty gold of early fall. The gravel of Forest Road 9 had a new set of tyre tracks worn into it, ones that hadn't been there before. Della had a truck now, a modest one used, paid for in cash, the first instalment of the bearer bonds, cashed through a broker in Sandpoint that Frank had found her. She'd kept the old sedan too, parked behind the cabin. Some things you didn't get rid of just because you could. The estate accounting had taken most of the summer to untangle. Glenn resigned as personal representative, rather than face the prosecutor's full review. A plea deal spared him jail time in exchange for restitution. $60,000, repaid to the estate over 5 years. His new truck sold to cover the first payment. Carol fought harder and lost worse. A civil judgment for the $31,400 plus interest. The Priest River property went up for a forced sale that had closed just 2 weeks ago. Della hadn't celebrated either outcome. She'd simply let the county do what the county does, the way Hollis had built it to happen all along. What she had celebrated quietly was the cabin. She and Walt spent the summer weekends rebuilding it properly. Not the shack it had been. A real home. Insulated. Rewired. The tin roof replaced with something that wouldn't rattle every time the wind came down off the ridge. The cast iron cook stove stayed exactly where it was, warm wall and all. Some things you didn't replace either. Above the door, where a house number might have gone, Della hung a hand-carved sign. Walt made it in his shop. The same careful, even hand he'd once shown her in a soldered seam. It read, Marie's Pines. For your grandmother, Walt said when he brought it out. Seemed right. She's the one he built it all for, even if he never said it plain. Della cried a little at that too, standing in the doorway of the place her whole family had once called worthless. It didn't feel like grief this time. It felt like something closing correctly. The way a good seam closes, tight and even, no wasted motion. Frank still called every few weeks with updates on the accounting. There was less urgency in his voice now. The calm of a case winding down, not heating up. On one call, near the end of summer, he mentioned something Della hadn't expected. Your uncle asked me to pass something along, Frank said. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry. Not the courtroom kind. He said he spent 30 years measuring his father by what the man didn't give him, and never once thought to ask what the man might have been protecting. Della sat with that on the porch step, Sam nearby stacking pine cones into a wobbling tower that fell over every few minutes, to his enormous delight. Is he actually sorry? She asked. Or is he sorry he got caught? Fair question, Frank said. I think it started as the second thing, became a little of the first over time. People do sometimes grow into their own better excuses. Doesn't undo what he did. But he's made every restitution payment on time so far. That's more than I expected from him in June. Della didn't answer right away. She thought about Glenn at the reading, laughing at a dollar bill. She thought about him in the courtroom, jaw tight, the colour of old paper. Then, finally, she thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, the one that told her to make them read every word out loud, not to destroy them, just to make the truth impossible to avoid any longer. Tell him, she said slowly, that if he wants to see Sam sometime supervised at a time I choose, that's a door I'll leave open. Not for him. For Sam. Every kid deserves the chance to know his family, even the parts that disappointed somebody. That's generous, Frank said. More generous than most people would manage. It's not really generosity, Della said. Hollis forgave people's debts his whole life and never once told them. I don't need Glenn to earn his way back completely. I just need him to know the door's not welded shut. Grandpa would have wanted that part left open too, I think. He just didn't leave the letter that told me so. She hung up and looked out at the pines, at the new roof, glinting faintly in the last of the afternoon light, at Sam's tower of pine cones, falling over for the 4th time. Rosa still came out most Sundays now, bringing something from the Thriftway's day-old bakery rack, She'd sit on the porch step with Della while Sam ran wild in the yard. Louise from the bank had become, unexpectedly, something like a friend, calling every so often just to check in. The two of them had formed a small, quiet alliance in that vault room, the day everything started to turn. And Walt was out here most weekends still. Not because Della needed the work done anymore, because, as he put it once gruffly, not looking at her when he said it, some habits are worth keeping, even after the reason for them changes. That evening, after Rosa left and Walt drove home and Sam finally wound down enough to sleep, Della sat at the cabin table with the lamp burning. The same lamp. The same table. The panel behind the stove sat closed now, repaired, sealed properly this time, not to hide anything, because a wall works better closed. She took out Hollis's letter one more time. She'd read it so many times the folds had gone soft as cloth. I love you. I always did. I just built it into a wall instead of saying it, because that's the only language I ever trusted. Della folded it back up. Careful the way you fold something you mean to keep a long time. She put it in the drawer beside the deed, the tax receipts, and the small spare sign Walt had carved her, just in case, that also read Marie's Pines. She banked the stove for the night, the way Hollis had taught her, cross-hatched. Room to breathe. She stood a moment longer looking at the warm iron, at the wall behind it that no longer hid anything at all. Everything it had ever protected was finally, fully, hers. Outside, the pines held their long quiet, the way they always had, and behind the closed panel the warm wall kept its heat long after the fire went out. Above the door, the carved sign caught the last of the light. Marie's Pines. Late that October, the county held its annual harvest supper in the Grange Hall on Main Street, the kind of small-town event Della had gone to exactly twice in her whole life. Both times as a kid, dragged along by an aunt who'd rather have been anywhere else. This year, she went on purpose. Sam sat on her hip, in a corduroy jacket Rosa had found second-hand, and pressed for her. She almost didn't recognise the room when she walked in. People she'd known her whole life, people who'd never said two words to her at the will reading, came up one after another. They shook her hand, asked about the cabin, asked about Sam, asked carefully whether she'd heard anything more about the county prosecutor's review. She hadn't much. Frank told her these things moved slow, slower than courtroom drama ever suggested. Patience was still the whole game, same as it had always been. Louise from the bank found her by the dessert table. I heard the roof's done, she said. My sister says it looks like a real home out there now. It is a real home, Della said. Took a while to look the part. Some things take a while, Louise said. Doesn't make them any less true the whole time they were catching up. Walt showed up an hour in, no longer wearing his good shirt for court, just his regular flannel. He looked more like himself than Della had seen him in months. He brought a pie, his late wife's recipe, the kind of thing he only made twice a year. He set it down at the dessert table like it cost him something, and was worth it anyway. Figured Hollis would have wanted somebody to bring his favourite to a town supper again, Walt said. Been a long time since anybody did. Della cut herself a slice. One bite in, she understood exactly why Hollis had loved it, and exactly why Walt had waited this long to make it again. Near the end of the evening, the hall thinning out, Sam asleep against her shoulder for the second time that week, Della found herself standing near the door beside Mrs. Aldrich, the retired schoolteacher from the Thriftway checkout line. I heard how the hearing went, Mrs. Aldrich said. The whole county's heard, dear. Small towns don't keep courthouse gossip quiet for long. No, Della said. I don't suppose they do. For what it's worth, the older woman said, I taught your grandfather's grandchildren's whole generation. Taught Glenn too, 30-some years back. Bright boy. Never once figured out that being loved and being given things aren't the same thing. Some people take a whole lifetime to learn that. Some never do. She patted Della's arm. You learned it early. That's rarer than people think. Della thought about that the whole drive home. Sam asleep in his car seat. The truck's headlights carved a steady tunnel through the dark pines. She pulled up to the cabin a little after 9 and found unexpectedly a car she didn't recognise parked at the head of the gravel. Glenn's car. Not the truck, sold now to cover restitution. The old sedan he'd apparently kept. He sat on the porch step in the dark, hands folded, waiting. For one sharp instant, Della's whole body went tight with the old wariness. Years of learning to brace before he spoke. I called Frank first, Glenn said quickly, standing as she approached. Asked if it was all right to come out. He said that part was up to you, not him. I should have called you directly. I'm sorry. I can go. You're already here, Della said, Say what you came to say. Glenn looked older in the porch light than he had in the courtroom, the specific tired of a man who'd spent months being smaller than he used to think he was. I'm not going to ask you to forgive the whole thing tonight, he said. I know that's not owed to me. I just wanted to say it to your face instead of through a lawyer. I was wrong about the land, wrong about the money, and I was wrong, before any of that, about you. I let myself believe you were the one who never showed up. It was easier than admitting I was. Della stood with Sam's weight warm and heavy against her chest. She let the silence sit a moment before she answered. Some things deserved a pause before a response. This was one of them. You want to know the part that actually hurt, Glenn, she said finally. It wasn't the dollar bill, it wasn't the laugh. It was that for 11 years, every single Sunday I drove out here. Some part of me hoped you'd show up too. Just once. You never did. Then you stood in a courtroom and called me the one who isolated him. Glenn's jaw worked, the same way it had in the courtroom. But there was no bluster in it now. Just something raw and unguarded that Della had genuinely never seen on her uncle's face before. I know, he said quietly. I've had a lot of nights to sit with that. Good, Della said, not unkindly. Sit with it a while longer. Then, if you still mean it, you can start by showing up. Not with money. Not with an apology tour. Just show up. Sundays maybe. See what Sam's like when he's 4. 5, 10. Let him know his family the slow way. The way it's supposed to happen. Instead of the way we did it. Glenn nodded, throat working like he was fighting something down. That's more than I expected. It's less than you deserve and more than you're owed, Della said. But Grandpa forgave people their whole lives, and never once made a show of it. I figure that's worth learning from too. He left a few minutes later. Della stood on the porch, a long time after his taillights disappeared down Forest Road 9. The second time in this whole story, a Mercer man had driven away from that cabin in the dark. This leaving felt different from the first one, back in the summer, when he'd come threatening and left angry. This time he'd come humbled. And left, she thought, maybe actually a little more human than when he'd arrived. She carried Sam inside and laid him down on the small bed Walt had built into the corner, where the old cot used to be. She stood a moment at the cook stove, palm flat against the closed panel. The day's last warmth still radiated faintly through the iron. Grandpa, she thought. Not quite a prayer, more a report card. I think I did what you'd have wanted. I made them read it out loud, and then, when it was done, I left the door open anyway. I think that's what the warm wall was really for. Not just the money. Learning when to open something back up, once the truth's finally out. She didn't know if Glenn would show up on a Sunday, or 2, or ever again. Some doors stayed open a long time before anyone walked through them. Some never got walked through at all. Either way, Della understood now. The door itself was worth keeping open. Not for the person who might come through it. For the kind of person keeping it open made you. Winter came early to Bonner County that year. The first snow dusted the pines by the second week of November. Della found herself for the first time in her adult life, not dreading it. She had money in the bank now. Real money. The bearer bonds cashed, the timber appraisal filed with the estate. The county escrow finally released into an account with her name on it and no one else's. She'd paid off the sedan's outstanding repair bills, bought Sam a proper winter coat instead of a hand-me-down 2 sizes wrong. Set the rest aside in a savings account Frank had helped her open, the kind with an actual interest rate, instead of a coffee can on a shelf. She still worked at the Thriftway 3 days a week. Rosa had asked her once, half joking, whether she planned to quit, now that she didn't need the paycheck. I don't need the paycheck, Della had said. I need the people. And the routine. Somewhere to be that isn't just me and Sam and $400,000 I still don't know what to do with. Fair enough, Rosa said. Though for the record, if I had $400,000, I would not be folding towel displays at 7 in the morning. Give it time, Della said. I only had it a few months. Ask me again next year. The gravel lease income started arriving quarterly, modest but steady. Della used the first check to do something she hadn't told anyone about in advance, not even Walt. She drove into Coles Ferry on a grey Saturday morning in early December, parked outside Sutter's small engine and repair, found Walt exactly where she expected, bent over a lawnmower engine, the dog asleep at his feet. Got something for you, she said, and handed him an envelope. Walt wiped his hands, opened it, and went very still. Inside was a check, $4,000, made out to Walter Sutter. Della, I can't take this. You already did, she said. Grandpa forgave your debt in 1997. $400, back when that was real money for your family. I'm not forgiving anything, because there's nothing left to forgive. I'm paying forward what he started. Call it interest. 30 years of it. Walt looked at the check a long moment, then at her. His eyes had gone bright, in a way he clearly wasn't going to acknowledge out loud. Your grandfather would be sitting right here, laughing at both of us for making a fuss over a piece of paper, he finally said. Probably, Della agreed. Take the check anyway. He did. Part of it, she found out later from Rosa, went to finally fix the roof on his own shop, which had been leaking since before Della was born. The rest he quietly passed to the Kessler family. The same family whose filling station mortgage Hollis had paid off decades before. Their youngest had just started community college and needed a car that ran. Word got around, the way it always did in Coles Ferry. Without ever quite intending it, Della found herself becoming the kind of quiet fixture in the county that Hollis had once been. She never announced anything, never wanted her name on it, but small envelopes started finding their way occasionally to people who needed them a little more than she did that particular month. She never once mentioned where the idea had come from. Everyone who mattered already knew. Sam's third birthday fell on the second Sunday of December. Della threw him a small party at the cabin. Walt and Rosa and Louise crowded into the front room, once a cold, single space, now warm clear through, insulated properly, heated by a stove that no longer needed a hidden panel to matter. Glenn came too. He'd started showing up most Sundays since October. Quiet, careful, never overstaying. He brought small gifts for Sam, always a little too expensive, a little too eager. The gifts of a man still learning the difference between buying affection and earning it. Della let him come anyway. She watched him learn, slowly, the way a person learns a language late in life. More effort than grace, but real effort all the same. Carol never came. Della hadn't expected her to. The civil judgment had taken most of what she had left. The last Della heard, she'd moved to Coeur d'Alene to live with a sister, and hadn't spoken to Glenn in months. Some doors, Della had come to understand, stayed shut no matter how long you left them unlocked. That wasn't a failure on anyone's part. Some people simply chose the shut door, every single time it was offered to them open. After the party, once Sam was down for a nap, and the guest had gone, Della sat alone at the cabin table, a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She looked around the room at everything the year had built. The new roof, the insulated walls, the sign above the door, catching the last of the December light every afternoon at almost exactly the same angle, like it had been hung there on purpose to do exactly that. Marie's Pines. She thought about the dollar bill fluttering to a courthouse floor, 8 months ago now. About $31, counted twice in a parking lot. About a note that told her to mind which wall stayed warm. She thought about all the Sundays before any of it. The ones nobody had asked her to drive out for. The ones that had, in the end, turned out to be the only inheritance that ever really mattered. The habit of showing up when nothing was owed to her, and nothing was promised back. She got up and banked the stove one more time for the night. She stood a moment with her palm flat against the warm iron, the way she had that very first evening, before she knew what the wall was hiding. Before she knew any of it. The wall didn't need to hide anything anymore. It just needed to stay warm. Outside the window, snow had started falling steady over the pines, soft and quiet, settling over the gravel road, the new roof, the carved sign above the door. Della Mercer stood in the doorway of the only thing her family had ever truly given her. She watched it come down white and even, covering everything old. For one long moment, the whole world outside looked entirely new. Spring found the pines green again by April, the snow long gone off the gravel. Della marked 1 full year since the will reading by doing something small and quiet, the way Hollis had always done the things that mattered most. She drove into Coles Ferry, stopped at the courthouse, and filed a simple form with the county recorder. The kind of paperwork nobody in a family usually thinks to file, until it's too late to matter. She added Sam's name to the deed. Not the whole of it, not yet. He was 3 years old. He had no need to own 80 acres of Idaho timber before he could tie his own shoes. But a future interest recorded and certain. The kind of thing a lawyer calls a remainder, and a mother calls a promise. Frank notarized it himself in his same modest grey suit. When it was done, he slid the recorded copy across his desk with something that, on Frank Ostrander, passed for genuine warmth. Your grandfather started something 23 years ago that nobody was supposed to see coming, Frank said. Looks like you're just going to keep doing that. Someone has to, Della said. She folded the paper carefully, the same careful fold she used on every document that mattered now, a habit she hadn't noticed picking up from a dead man's letter until this exact moment. Might as well be me. I had good teachers. She drove home that afternoon with the recorded copy on the seat beside her, past the church with its sign finally updated after 2 years, past the mill that had reopened under new ownership, past every familiar mile of Forest Road 9. She pulled up to the cabin just as the last of the daylight caught the carved sign above the door. Marie's Pines, lit gold in the low spring sun, standing exactly where a joke of a shack had once stood, exactly where a family had once laughed at a single dollar bill and thought that was the end of the story. It hadn't been the end. It had barely been the beginning.